there, and I think Sandy comes and they tell you all about the church and what our goals are and what we really believe. So that's a great first step. So if you haven't done that class yet, that's next Sunday. Just make a note on your connection card that you're interested in that, and we'll make sure that you get the invite and all the information about where that's going to be after church next Sunday. The rest of our announcements are going to be on the rundown.
So we didn't plan this, but this actually fits really well with the message for this morning. So Noah, you can go ahead and kill the rundown. Hey, my name is Grayson, and I say this is funny because the series that we're in this morning is called Interrupted, and it's all about how interruptions in our life, how God uses those interruptions to get our attention. And it's funny because we know that things don't always go according to plan. Like, I wish I could say, like, oh, hey, this is my sermon illustration this morning. But, God gives you an illustration sometimes, and you just got to roll with it. But we know what it's like to be doing something, to be living our life, and to experience an interruption. Maybe that was you planning to go to school or planning to go to graduate school, and something came in and interrupted your life. Maybe it was, the picture of, in 5 years, we're going to have 2 kids and a white picket fence, and that's going to be our life. And it doesn't go that way. Something comes along and interrupts your plans. To be human is to live in a world in which we face interruptions every day. Constantly. And there's a story I want to share with you that I think illustrates this. There's in preparing for this week, I came across the story of a man named Christopher Yuan. And Christopher Yuan was he was born to Chinese parents who had immigrated to the United States, and he was born and grew up around Chicago. And for Christopher, he was a smart young man. He really excelled at school, and so he made plans to go to college and then eventually to go into graduate school. He was going to become a dentist, and so he made it into dental school. Now, during that time, his parents, who were not followers of Jesus, accepted Christ. And it radically changed their life. But for Christopher at that time, he didn't want anything to do with his parents' newfound faith. That wasn't what he was interested in. And so he decided to instead pursue his own interests, which at the time included rampant sexual activity and drug abuse. And so those two things really filled out his life. Now, being a graduate student or being a college student, he didn't have a lot of money. He was kind of living paycheck to paycheck, and so he realized that he could start making money selling the very thing he was using, and so he became a drug dealer on his campus. But it didn't take long for the university, until the university found out, and they kicked him out with only 4 months left in his dental degree. So close. But fortunately for him, or unfortunately, he realized that he had a new career path open to him, and that was to begin selling drugs. And so Christopher moved down to Atlanta, and he started dealing drugs, and he was actually pretty good at it. He ended up making a really good living for himself, and he thought that life was good. I don't need dental school. I'm just going to do this. I'm going to sell drugs. I'm going to, kind of go from relation to relationship, and life is good. But his parents had the foresight to see that no, the life he was living was headed for destruction. And so they tried to maintain that relationship with him. They prayed for him. His mom even spent days praying and fasting specifically for her son. But she knew that the only way that his life was going to change would be for God to get a hold of it, for God to interrupt his life. They even tried to go down and spend some time with him one week, and after about 2 days, Christopher kicked them out of his house, and that was the sort of relationship they had. So she knew if anything was going to change in his life, it wasn't going to be because of what she did, but because of what the Lord did. Unfortunately, the Lord came through and answered that prayer. Fortunately, sometime later, after Christopher received a particularly large shipment of drugs, it was about, I think, 6 tons is what he said, he heard a knock on his door, and he went to the door, and he opened it up, and to his surprise, there were 12 police officers and 2 drug dogs standing outside of his door. And it was in that moment that his life took a very different turn. Now, to make a long story short, he did end up going to prison, and while he was in prison, at his lowest point is when he found Christ. It's when he found the life transformation that his parents had experienced years before. And so now afterwards, when he got out, he became he did end up going and getting, I believe, a different degree, and now he's a Bible teacher, speaker, author, and he shares his testimony with people, showing them just what God can do in someone's life, no matter how far gone they feel. And I share that because, like I said, we're in a series called Interrupted. We're talking about how God uses the interruptions in our life to get our attention. Now, for Christopher, it was a knock on his door that turned out to be 12 police officers and 2 drug dogs. You might not have experienced that. I haven't. You might not have experienced what it's like for the police to show up at your door, but like I've said, we've all experienced what it's like to have our lives interrupted, to have our lives changed, whether that's because of a diagnosis or news we received or a death in the family. We know what it's like to have our lives interruption, but what if God had more planned for those interruptions than we imagined? In fact, the phrase that we've used to sort of frame in this series is this simple phrase, and I want to show it to you again. We mentioned it last week. I want to show you again, and it's this. It's that interruptions are God's invitations. Interruptions are God's invitations. And I think you'll see that in the story that we're going to be looking at in Scripture this morning. We're going to be in the book of Joshua, the Old Testament book. If you don't know where that is, don't feel bad. Just open up that table of contents and you can find it there, or the words are going to be up here on the screen. But before we dive into that, I do need to give just 3 minutes of just a little bit of context to make this story make sense. So in the book of Joshua, what we find is it's pretty early in Israel's history. So many of you may recall how Moses led the people out of Egypt, right? The dramatic, the plagues of Egypt, and then parted the Red Sea and led the people out in this dramatic show of God's power. But then after that, you may also remember that the Israelites ended up sort of grumbling, right? They acted like a bunch of toddlers out in the wilderness, complaining the whole time. And they ended up fashioning other gods and started turning away from the God that had led them out. And so what God does as punishment is he says, now this entire generation for 40 years, you're going to wander in the wilderness. And it's going to be the next generation that I will lead into the promised land. And so after those 40 years, after that generation had died off, Joshua, who was Moses' right-hand man, then took up the mantle. And he was a man full of faith, a godly man, and he was going to be the one to lead them into the promised land. And that's exactly what they did. The land at the time was called the land of Canaan, and there were all these different tribes worshiping a plethora of other gods. And so Joshua's task was to lead the people in to carve out a little slice for this fledgling nation called Israel to call home. And in this journey, they came across a fortified town called Jericho. Now, Jericho was a really big city at the time. It had these large walls. And so if Israel was going to get into the land, they had to get past Jericho. So to deal with this situation, Joshua sent out 2 spies, and he told them, he said, you look over the land, but specifically look at Jericho and see what you can find. When the 2 spies went into Jericho, the first place they went to, or one of the first places they went to, was what was called the house of Rahab the prostitute. Now, the text is clear. They didn't go there for any sort of sexual exploits. They went there to get information. And many scholars believe that the house of Rahab was less of a home for Rahab and actually more of a tavern or an inn. And Rahab, as the prostitute, may have been, maybe the business lady who sort of ran things there. But regardless, it was a really good place for them to get information, right? So they could go and they could really see what the people, the common people of Jericho thought, and if there were any weaknesses. But what's astounding is not simply that took place, but that Rahab realized that those spies were from Israel. And instead of turning them into the authorities, she actually goes and hides them on her roof and leads the authorities elsewhere. And it's after that that she comes and speaks with the spies, and that's really what I want us to look at this morning, is what she says. And in ancient texts and in the Bible, where the dialogue is usually where the place of emphasis is. And so you'll see this morning that this is sort of the thrust of this chapter. And so I want to go ahead and read with you, starting in verse 8. We're going to look at verses 8 through 14 of Joshua chapter 2. And this is where the story picks up. Rahab goes to the roof. It says in verse 8, it says, "Before the spies went to sleep that night, Rahab went up on the roof to talk with them. 'I know the Lord has given you this land,' she told them. 'We are all afraid of you. Everyone in the land is living in terror, for we have heard how the Lord made a dry path for you through the Red Sea when you left Egypt. And we know what you did to Sihon and Og, the two Amorite kingdoms east of the Jordan River, whose people you completely destroyed. No wonder our hearts have melted in fear. No one has the courage to fight after hearing such things. For the Lord your God is the supreme God of the heavens above and the earth below. Now,' she says, 'swear to me by the Lord that you will be kind to me and my family since I have helped you. Give me some guarantee that when Jericho is conquered, you will let me live along with my father and mother and brothers and sisters and all their families. We offer you our own lives as a guarantee for your safety,' the men agreed. 'If you don't betray us, we will keep our promise and be kind to you when the Lord gives us the land.'" This is God's word. Now, there's a few things to point out just to help make this make sense. So first, what Rahab says a number of just really, really interesting things, especially if you're thinking that this is a resident of Jericho, this is a woman from the land of Canaan. There's a lot of national pride there. What's interesting is she points out, she says, "I have heard," but not just she says, "We all have heard the works that your God has done." And she starts recounting those stories, how God led you out of Egypt, how God parted the Red Sea, how he gave you victory over the other nations. You see, in the Old Testament, there were signs that were part of God's authority. And you see, even in Exodus, how those signs weren't just done as magic tricks. They were done so that the people of Israel could have credibility as they went out into the world. That as other nations looked on Israel, they would say, "Wait a second, there is a God that means business." Not like our idols that are crafted out of wood, but there is a God that is living and active in that nation. And you see here, this is one example of how that message actually went out, how people received that. Now, instead of like Rahab actually giving herself or giving themselves over to the God of Israel, many nations tried to fight against that, right? Tried to fight against the God of Israel. Now, like I said, we don't know a whole lot about Rahab personally, other than that she likely worked in a tavern, maybe was the owner, and she was a prostitute. We don't know much other than that. But I could imagine that, like many people, Rahab was really, probably up until that point, really concerned with her day-to-day. Like, she just wanted to put food on the table. She wanted to make sure that she had a roof over her head, that she had a place to sleep, and she had some food that she could fill her belly with. And sometimes that's all we want. But it wasn't until she heard about the God of Israel heading her way that she realized something's about to change, let alone once she met those spies. I'm going to ask you, when was the last time that things didn't go according to your plans? Maybe you think this morning, right? Maybe it was last week, maybe it was last month. When was the last time you made plans and things didn't happen the way that you had planned? I can think back to when I was married, am married, still am, honey, still am, no surprises. My wife and I have been married for about almost 9.5 years. Next year will be our 10-year anniversary, and it's been a wonderful, wonderful almost 10 years. But one of the things I can remember is about 5 days or so before we were married, before our wedding, my grandfather passed away. And it wasn't completely unexpected. We knew it was probably going to be, maybe any month. We just didn't expect it to be then. And if you've been in a wedding, if you've been to a wedding, if you've been a part of planning weddings, you know there's a lot that goes into that. There is a lot of planning. And me and my family were going to head up there a few days before, help with setup, help with continued planning, putting everything together. And everything got put on halt when that happened. And instead of planning, my family planning for a wedding, we began planning for a funeral. Now, it all worked out. We had the funeral, and it was a lovely, meaningful funeral. And then we hightailed it to our destination where we were married a few days later. And it's been 9.5 wonderful years. But that was one moment, and one among many moments in my life where you realize there are some things you just can't plan for. And if I were to ask for a show of hands, I imagine all of our hands would go up as you think about those times in your life where things didn't go according to plan, where your life was interrupted. No, in spite of how meticulously you planned things. It's been said many times that life is what happens to us while we're making other plans. Life is what happens to us when we're making other plans, meaning that the real grittiness of life is what happens while we're planning for what our life should look like. Like, our plans for what life should look like often differ very much so from what life actually is. Sometimes you plan to head east and you end up going west. You plan for a day of yard work and then you wake up and what? Of course, it's raining. Or sometimes things just happen. I think that's why in Proverbs, the writer says of Proverbs 16:9, says, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Meaning that there's no amount of planning we can do that, hey, if God doesn't want to see it done, it's not going to happen. Like, no matter how much we scream and kick and we try to plan, it's the Lord who establishes his steps. Rahab didn't plan for what happened to her. Rahab didn't plan for Israel to invade. Rahab didn't plan to meet spies. However, she did make an important choice. Instead of choosing to trust in her own cleverness or choosing to trust in the authorities of Jericho, she chose instead to trust in the Lord. After saying what she's heard about Israel, I just want to point out this incredible moment, this incredible statement, this declaration of faith in verse 11. She says, "For the Lord your God is supreme, is the supreme God of the heavens above and the earth below." This is a massive declaration of trust and faith. You see, because in Rahab's culture, in the Canaanite culture, they had dozens of other gods. They had some gods that were worshipped through orgies. There were some gods that were worshipped through child sacrifice. There was a variety of other gods and other idols that she worshipped and that she likely would have grown up worshiping. But in this moment, she expresses her faith that there is one God supreme above all the others. She says, of the heavens above and the earth below. In other words, that is her declaration of putting her flag in the sand. That I'm going to cast my lot with you and your God, who I have seen, or at least, maybe not seen, but who I have heard about. I have heard about the wonders and workings of your God. It is so much more than anything else I could trust in. In that culture, there was this sort of competition between other local gods. So there were some civilizations that would say, yeah, I'm okay with you having your own God and we have our own God. But what was important is that their God was more powerful. So it was sort of like the old, I bet my dad could beat up your dad. It was I bet my God can beat up your God. And so everybody had a lot of that national pride in their deity, whoever that may have been, or deities. But this is her making the astounding declaration that, no, I'm laying it down. I'm laying down my culture. I'm laying down what's familiar. And instead, I'm going to accept what I see and hear from your God. That you chose to trust. In fact, it's interesting because as someone who cast their lot with Israel, she was doing that as an outsider. She was in effect becoming a Jew adopting a different culture, not by birth, but by faith. And you see even later in the New Testament how as the early church looks back on her story, they identify her as a woman of faith, of profound faith. Just one example, the writer of Hebrews in Hebrews 11:31 says, "By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given friendly welcome to the spies." In other words, because she trusted in the Lord, she was saved. And in this chapter in the book of Hebrews, they call it the Hall of Faith. In other words, this is the chapter that lists out the great heroes of the faith. And they chose someone who wasn't born a Jew. They chose a prostitute. They chose someone on the outskirts of society to list among the most renowned people of the faith. It's a reminder that no matter who you are or what you've been through or what your life has looked like, that God has plans for you more than you could imagine for yourself. Like I said, we know that in life we're going to face interruptions. We know that we're going to face things that we just can't prepare for. And that's why my encouragement for you from what we've seen here today is to trust God with the interruptions of your life. Trust God with the interruptions in your life. And Rahab trusted God when her life was changing. Can you? Maybe you are in a season of change right now. What does a faith like Rahab's look like in your life? And when seasons of change unexpectedly come to disrupt your plans, what is your game plan? Right? Do you distract yourself? You just try to work harder? Or do you trust in the one that knows the outcome? I want to share with you one more story. This is of a man named Tyrone Flowers. He was born into a really difficult situation, and after one unexpected altercation with a man on a bus, his life was changed forever. And so rather than having me tell that, I want you to turn your attention to the screen to see maybe if we can hear Tyrone's story.
I was born out of wedlock to teenage parents. My mother and my father was unable to provide for me, and my grandmother stepped in to raise me and her 12 other children. At the age of 7, my grandmother became ill, and I was removed from her custody and placed in foster care. And that's when my life for the next 10 years went on a pretty challenging journey. Being placed in a basement overnight, sitting up on that top step, just bamming on the door, praying and wishing that they would let me out. I was told I would never amount to anything, I wouldn't be anything. Raised in poverty, we've always struggled when it came to having the resources to meet a lot of our basic needs. I was stealing from the corner liquor store, milk and cereal, and that was pretty much my diet. At the age of 10, my father was murdered. He was shot to death. And often people would always tell me, you're gonna be just like your father, either dead or in jail. I remember learning something, that's how to look good on the outside. You can have yourself well groomed, but on the inside I was going through so much pain. All I desired out of life was just my basic needs to be met. So here I am, 17, wanting to do things the right way, but didn't know how. My senior year, I got on a bus to go out to a friend of mine's house. When I got on the bus, I got in a verbal confrontation with a guy I played basketball with. I got off the bus, and he got off the bus shortly behind me. I threw up my guards thinking we were going to fight, and he pulled out a .357 Magnum. I just remember getting shot in my shoulder, in my neck, and my hands. I was instantly paralyzed because I didn't feel any pain, and I almost died that night. I was told I would never walk again, but the main thing that was ringing in my head was getting this person back, revenge. My goal was either to put him in a wheelchair or kill him. And during this time, I had questions for God like, Why me? He basically told me, in order to be forgiven, you have to forgive. And I knew I would have to forgive the guy that shot me. That was, the only way I was gonna be able to have this relationship with God. And that really helped me because it was the first time I really had that type of conversation with God. Now, what was really burning in my heart was, why did God save me? Why did I go through the things I went through? What is my purpose? I ended up getting a 4-ride scholarship to the University of Missouri, Columbia. I had to write a paper, and I decided to write it on the juvenile justice system. And I went back and visited some of the same juvenile institutions I was in as a kid. And this one kid came up to me, and I told him my testimony. Then he shared his life with me. And I went to the staff, and I basically said I didn't know that this particular kid had went through the things he went through. And the staff said we didn't either. So I thought the kid had lied to me. And that's when the kid looked at me and said, Mr. Flowers, I didn't lie to you. I've been lying to them. And that bothered me. I said, why me? And he said, because we shared the same cell. That one common denominator allowed him to open up and share his experience with me. And when I came outside, it was this lady, I believe to this day she was an angel. She approached me and said, I don't know where you came from or who you are, what you plan on doing. She said, but you have a gift in working with these kids. At that moment, I knew what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. God had just placed in my spirit that this was it. I dedicated my life to work with kids. I realized that if you're operating in God's perfect will, you're not disabled, because if you're operating His perfect will, He's going to enable you to do whatever He calls you to do, even if that's disabling you. I realized that the kids that I was working with, all of them are going through something that I've already experienced. Parents are incarcerated or dead, grew up in poverty, trouble in school, the lack of support emotionally, mentally, physically, educationally. So I knew God had equipped me uniquely to work with high-risk urban youth. I realized that it's not about me, it's about what God can do through me to change the lives of others. My name is Tyrone Flowers, and I am second.
It's a pretty powerful story. We know that change can happen to all of us. Like I said earlier, change, to live is to experience change. Maybe you experience change in your family. People grow up, kids grow up. Jobs change. People get older. Aging happens. Personalities evolve and shift. People change. Relationships change. And again, maybe you're in a season of unexpected change. Maybe not. Maybe things are going according to plan. But maybe not. Maybe you are in a season where things just don't look the way you imagined they would 5 or 10 years ago. For some of you, especially those who are on the other side of that change, you might look back and say, praise God, it is not what I expected or what I planned, because now is so much better. But if you're in that arc of change, it's hard. I don't want to give the idea that we're somehow robots that you put in a new input and we just adapt like that. We're not. We're humans. And when things don't go the way we expect, it's hard. And there is a challenge that comes with that. There is a stress. There is an anxiety. The loss of hopes and dreams sometimes. It can be a painful place to be. But again, what if God wants to do something in this specific season of your life? How can you trust God with what is going on right now? And if you're a follower of Jesus, again, think back to what Rahab cited, where she said, look, I know the God that you serve. I've heard about the stories. Sometimes God's own past faithfulness in our life is what we should be focusing on more than the fears of our future. Sometimes we need to think back and say, you know what? God has been with me through all those interruptions. God has been with me through all of those changes. And as painful as it was, I know that I can trust Him with my future rather than trust in the anxiety and the fear about my future. Now, that may not make your anxiety go away completely. Again, we're human. We can exist with both trust and fear sometimes. We can be like the Jew who came to Jesus and said, I believe, but help my unbelief. But how can you trust God with the season that you're going through right now by resting on His past faithfulness? And if there's nothing else, if you're like, listen, it is too dark for me to even see, 5 minutes ago, let alone 5 years ago, or whatever it happened to be, we have one example that we can always come back to. That is the bedrock of our hope. That is the bedrock of our faith. And that is Jesus' victory in death on the cross. His death, burial, and resurrection provided the way for us to have a hope that we say, no matter what I'm going through right now, I can look back to that point in history. And I know that if God was willing to give Himself for me, maybe, just maybe, I can trust Him with my future and trust Him with what I'm experiencing now, even if it doesn't look like I had planned. Again, it was God's past faithfulness that led Rahab to trust in the power of God. How has God worked in your past? And how can you trust Him with your future? I want to invite you to go ahead and take out communion. You should have received it as you came in this morning. And like I said, we take communion every week and we remember the cross, but we remember it in different ways. And in one of those ways that I want to draw your attention to as we take this is I want you to remember that singular moment in history where God proved His faithfulness. Because He didn't have to. We didn't deserve it. We didn't deserve to be saved. But He chose to do it all the same. And so as you take part the cup, hold up the bread. Jesus tells us that this is to symbolize His body, which is broken for us. He says, when you do this, you do so remembering me, because goodness, don't we need to be reminded? Church, may we take and remember His death for us. As you hold the cup, said it represents His blood that was shed for you and me, for the washing away of our sins and for new life. May we take and drink, remembering His faithfulness. As we continue in our time of response, I want to invite you to respond as God leads you this morning. Maybe that is through giving of your time, your talent, and your treasures, as we talked about in our last series. So what God is doing here so that we can make Him famous in our world, so that we can reach out and meet needs in our community. Maybe that is how you're being led to respond. Again, we took communion, but maybe it's through prayer. If you need prayer, myself, some others will be in the back. We'd love to be able to pray with you, celebrate with you, bring your concerns before the Lord. Or maybe it's in worship. And so I invite you to stand and continue to worship this morning as God leads you to.
I've heard 1,000 stories of what they think you're like, but I've heard the tender whisper of love in the dead of night, and you tell me that you're pleased and that I'm never alone. You're a good, good Father. That's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. I've seen many searching for answers, far and wide, but I know we're all searching for answers. Only you provide, 'cause you know just what we need before we say a word. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us. You are perfect in all of your ways. Perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways. Love so undeniable, I can hardly speak. Peace so unexplainable, I can hardly think as you call me. Deeper still as you call me. Deeper still as you call me. Deeper still into love, love, love. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You're a good, good Father. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who you are. It's who you are. It's who you are, and I'm loved by you. It's who I am. It's who I am. It's who I am. You are perfect in all of your ways. It's who you are. Perfect in all of your ways. You are perfect in all of your ways to us.
Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Point Church, for being with us this morning. If you're joining us online, thank you for joining us. As we get ready to depart, I just want to remind you of a couple of things. Like Dawn said, we have our Discover class happening next week. That is right after service. Food and childcare are provided. If you want to learn more about what it means to be a part of this church family, you're not signing your life away. You're not making any commitments. You're just learning what it is we value, what direction we're headed, and what our hopes for our community are. I invite you to come to that. Again, it's next Sunday. If you'll do us a favor, you can just show up. But if you'll do us a favor, just make a note on your Connect card. Drop that in the Connect card bucket on your way out, just so we can make sure to prepare a place for you. Also, Next week is our last week of our Care and Kit Drive. That is where we are collecting supplies for students and teachers of East Garner Middle School. So one of our sayings is that we want to be more than renters. We see this as our mission field. We don't just want to hand in a check every month, but we actually want to make a difference in the landscape of this community. And so one of the ways we can do that is by providing supplies for students. 70% of students who attend this middle school receive free or reduced lunches by the government, which says something about the situations in which they're coming from. And so we want to be able to provide things like deodorant, hygiene products, feminine care products, things like that, which sometimes these kids don't always receive, and teachers are often having to pay out of their own pockets when these needs arise. And so we want to be able to meet those needs by blessing those teachers and those students. So we'll be collecting those today, been out in the lobby, and also collecting them again next week. Also, one of our desires is to bless the teachers, and we do that every month by stocking their break room with goodies and drinks, just as a way of us saying that we see you, we value you, we love you. And so if you want to pick up any snacks or drinks or things, you can also drop those off in the bin, and they will go to good use. With that said, Point Church, thank you so much again for joining us. If you have any prayer requests, you can make a note on your Connect card. We'll pray for those every week. But go out into this world and point people to Jesus. I'll see you out there.